Cool. So context is there. Let me know if you have any other questions about it. I did put in some considerations that I just wanted to highlight real quick. I don't think any idea should be off the table at this point. I think everyone can contribute and should. I think the goal of the next weeks is to iterate, experiment, and get as many feedback cycles as possible, so that we can set ourselves up for basically a smooth transition into focusing on refactoring and sort of these strategic goals that involve lots of refactoring. And then I also would say, think big in terms of ideals. I think we can work backwards, identify and remove constraints and think about like how to MVC our way towards the ideal. But sometimes we think just in like MVC and not the end goal. And I think we need to balance both of those as we kind of discuss this. And then sort of there's some blockers that I kind of notified. I think one of the goals is to, as quickly as possible, get epics migrated to issue types. Because I think Kristen, if you want to drop that, Kristen's not here. Well, she put together this spreadsheet basically that has all of the fields on issues, all the fields on epics requirements, and basically where there's this duplication, and we sort of want to reach parity as quickly as possible. So Holly, did you drop that in, or Alexis?
Trying to. I think, yeah, it's in here.
Thank you. So I don't want to hog the conversation. I think I just wanted to start out with some questions and then let the team kind of drive. First, like, do we agree on the working hypothesis that I kind of laid out above, that if we spend a few milestones focusing solely on these three things, we'll be more efficient and responsive in the future in terms of delivering value? Do we agree with that hypothesis? And is there anything else to add?
I had a question about the problem that we're looking to solve. So I get that we're looking to be more efficient and responsive. How are we not being efficient and responsive, so that we can be aware of that as we go into this next session?
Sure. So if I can kind of highlight this real quick. See here. If I were to like step back for a second and look at what we would do over the next year if we didn't move forward with this approach, I kind of laid out this like iteration path of like how I see things playing out based on how I've watched us evolve over the last 18 months. We basically would end up doing a lot of duplicated work between all of the different plan objects, whether that's epics. Like, for example, epics need assignees, right? Epics need the ability to assign milestones directly to them, right? And maybe the issues below them inherit them. There's like a lot of different things where epics don't have a certain thing that an issue has. An issue has something that an epic doesn't have. A requirement I need something, or a test case. And we end up like doing MVCs, like lots of small MVCs across the board, but it ends up just sort of like duplicating things. Another good example would be like epic boards. Like, we had to go create a whole new like model for that, and like all these other things just support, so we could have epics on boards. And whereas if we had issue types at the time, and epics is a basically work item hierarchy of issue types, we wouldn't need to go off and do all this extra work just to have an epic board. I think it also makes iterating a lot faster. Instead of iterating across all these different objects, we can iterate on the core set of primitives that can be reused across all of them. So that's sort of where I'm coming from a more efficient in the future for delivering customer value, because we'll be all sort of working on the same system instead of across separate models that are each belong to each of the different groups within plan. So that's one of the problems. The other is that we do need to refactor the issue view to be more performant, to support real time. And so we can either refactor that with our current UX, or if we're going to have to be rebuilding out anyways as a single view app, we have the opportunity to address some underlying UX challenges that we need to solve. And then also building a consistent sort of like UX system for extensible issues will make it easier to add future capabilities, whether we want to layer on new little like fancy widgets or integrate things from other parts of the product into issues itself. Vulnerabilities is a good example where they want to kind of have vulnerabilities linked directly to issues. And there was a design proposal for that, and it looks a lot like linking issues to one another in terms of relating them, but it was also slightly different. So how can we have like sort of consistent pattern that other teams can integrate their product features into issues as well? So there's lots of different problems to solve that I kind of want to tackle as part of this work stream.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Gabe, do we also want to work on changing some of the other kind of like paradigms that we've established? So I'm thinking like labels and scope labels versus workflows. Should we take this opportunity to maybe switch some of that and have our framework like not so dependent on labels? Or is that something where even with this refactor, we kind of want to have parity with what we currently have on labels? And then maybe just keep in mind that we want to allow the flexibility to change those things in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I sort of think about some of those things as new features, like an example of like scope labels versus workflow statuses. We have an epic, which I linked down in 1B I guess on that, where we want to allow for customizable issue statuses down the road, right? Which would sort of negate the need for scope labels to denote workflows. How far we want to go with this, I'm going to leave the scope up to the team, but I was sort of thinking of like having the kind of feature freeze be, let's not add net new capabilities. Let's like take what is our current system and put it into this new extensible like kind of plan object so that we can get epics down to that level, knowing that as soon as we want to start adding new features, we're going to be adding, you know, customizable issue statuses, issue types will be customizable down the road, and some of those other things. So it's almost like laying the foundation for doing that work in the future, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question, or is that a bad response or unclear?
No, it definitely does. Thank you.
Holly, you want to vocalize your next question?
Yeah, just the specific timeline. So I saw in the description above it mentioned 14.1. Is this going to be for just that time frame that we kind of want to make this the primary focus? And then I can see Alexis and I and Mike are all kind of articulating questions surrounding priority during this time. I assume this takes priority over pretty much everything else.
I
And
think
that's
it
phrased
does.
as the question.
Yeah, I would say that it does, largely because we want to get epics converted to a type of issue as quickly as possible so that we can basically have a single view that we iterate on. We want to be able to pay down that technical debt as quickly as possible for having these like kind of duplicated objects. And then the other thing that we want to like set ourselves up for is that pushing the consolidation or simplification of groups and projects, where we want to make issues available at the group level. Now we only have to do that one place instead of making issues available at the group level and then epics available at the project level. We basically would be able to reduce the amount of work we would have to do there, the faster that we can get towards, faster we can realize, I guess, the kind of strategy that we're taking here.
So that also includes merge requests, feedback requests from other designers, those things, or is there maybe an exception? Obviously, I assume anything that's maybe like hair on fire, there's a big problem that needs to be addressed, but
I will basically say, Gabe, managers of one at GitLab. So like, this is a goal that I think we should have as a stage, how you balance your work and like other demands. Like I trust everyone to be a good manager for themselves. So that's kind of how I would approach it. I think in terms of like product priorities, I would put this highest of the list, but in terms of your day-to-day and how you get your job done, that's your call.
so not to push back a little bit more, but that for me, that makes me a little anxious because I don't feel that I'm properly understanding and addressing expectations by the team. Does anybody else feel that way, or is that just me? If so, I can work on it within myself.
Can you repeat that, Holly? Like what the cause of your anxiety is?
Well, it just makes me a little anxious to do the manager of one approach in this because it seems like we are all kind of converging on a single approach together. But if we're not all aligned on what the expectations are, then I feel a little bit like, well, I might just take the reins and do my own thing. Not that we're working in a silo, but I do want to be sure that I understand the expectations of the group in terms of what we are striving to have done by the end of this sprint. so that I can stay focused on the right things personally.
So I'll share that I have anxiety about that also, maybe not so much within the team level, because I feel like us as a group or us in the larger stage can work together to get aligned on the approach we want to take here. I'm more concerned with getting buy-in or working with team other stages, especially because like so many other teams are dependent on issuables. If we change the underlying structure of issuables, do we at what point do we get buy-in from everyone else that uses issuables essentially?
And that actually kind of goes back to my question of what we're looking to have accomplished by the end of this. If it's just kind of a large spike where we're just researching and investigating and brainstorming, then maybe we aren't necessarily committing ourselves to anything. But if we are looking to have something maybe coded and committed by then, I agree with you, Donald. I have that concern as well.
The first 8 weeks is not, this is where I'm not going to dictate what we do. We might want to code at the same time along with UX. I think engineering needs to be involved in whatever we do from a UX standpoint, just for collaboration, providing guidance. But the goal in this next 8 weeks is to say, like, if we were to start from scratch and rebuild the issue view to support what we have today, what should it be, basically, right? Because it has to support, and I kind of put this into like the blockers to convert epics basically to a work item hierarchy, is we sort of need a revamped issue view UX system. Right now, there's some problems with it that I kind of outlined. It's like there's too much scrolling. It's hard to collaborate. It's hard to accomplish my tasks as an issue maintainer, basically, because it involves like lots of scrolling back and forth, lots of losing my place, lots of opening new tabs and other things like that. We also want to have issues viewable on boards without having to navigate away from that, which the easiest way to do that is to have a single view app. There's also where I think Tim Zalman converted the repo into single view app, was like, hey, here's all these performance benefits we get from doing this. So we should fast follow on the issue view as well. So like there's lots of things there. But the first 8 weeks is really what defining what we need to change about it so that we can have an effective roadmap from starting in 14.1 from an engineering standpoint of tackling the refactoring in as efficient way as possible, right? So we basically have 8 weeks to run design sprints and kind of get feedback from the organization. We can decide whether or not we want to include merge requests in this or not. I was talking with Kai, and he said that the create team doesn't have a huge appetite for refactoring merge requests into a single view app, but they sort of like are doing that anyways with, I think, code review maybe and some other stuff. So we also have an OKR in Q2 to improve the performance of discussions on merge requests, which is also shared with issues. So it's sort of like, I think we should drive towards, ideally, merge requests would be supported in this, but if they opt not to, then we can basically, we don't have to have parity with merge requests. I don't think we should let ourselves get blocked in by that, right? If they want to participate in it, then great, but.
Yeah, exactly. I think at a minimum, awareness would be good. And then above awareness would be participation. Merge requests satisfy very different jobs and use cases than the issue tracking and product planning stuff anyhow. And I'm happy to sort of, from the sidelines, help people understand that they're different and they don't need to be consistent. Unless we're talking about like maybe some elements of the top bar ought to be in the same place where we expect to find it, you know, small things like that. But I personally don't think that MRs need to be deeply involved with this change to the planning capabilities. This is my personal opinion. Happy to hear other opinions though.
I think the main risk there is just in places where they're like intrinsically linked from a code perspective. So like discussions, anything we do with, you know, Gabe mentioned like the scrolling of discussions and like that whole thing being sort of painful right now on issues. That's sort of a direct overlap with merge requests and anywhere else where there's nodes. So I guess like we have to scope the changes that we intend to make there in a certain way to like, we can make changes in the way that they're rendered possibly, or like we could make drastic changes, but at any time if we're gonna, sort of drastically overhaul the discussions endpoint, which is what loads comments and things like that, then that's where we have to collaborate across stage, because otherwise we'll, just break stuff elsewhere.
What about for this, this first go, these first iterations, we don't touch discussions at all. Would that work for you, Gabe?
It would work for me to the extent we're still going to have to refactor discussions into being view based and using subscriptions endpoint instead of the real, basically the real time endpoint that we use now for polling. So there are going to be some technical changes there, but I think that given we want to, we basically don't have to change the let's put it this way. We don't have to change the UX of discussions right now necessarily, like how they're rendered and how they look. I think there's some things that I would want to change about where they're placed on the view maybe. But I'm fine not tackling that, changing it significantly. There's also the thing where, what if we decide to rebuild discussions as part of the bigger view app? We can make the discussions its own view app that lives within the bigger view app. And then we realize that the change we're making are these huge performance wins. Then that can be like adapted into merge requests eventually too. So I think you're right about the awareness is important and participation maybe would come next. But for this next 8 weeks, I think that's where we can tease out what exactly we want to change and then decide what level of involvement we would need from someone else or from the create team. Does that make sense? Because right now we don't even know what we would want to change. So if we just say, hey, we're not going to even explore changing anything there because of this thing that we think is a dependency before it's really a dependency, maybe a little bit self-limiting right now. That's
quick note. Discussions are already a view application, Gabe. It's Notes app. It's completely view, but it's not GraphQL. Basically, from what I get from Andrea from Source Coding Pod Review, they don't plan to refactor it to GraphQL anytime soon. Maybe in like next 6 months, they are not touching it, refactoring to GraphQL, because I've been discussing this. So it's a view application, it's good. It's REST, it's not good. The only thing that we can do is to include it into the global state of the page. And this is doable. We're already doing it with widget partly. So we can communicate the global state back and forth with a Notes application, widget discussions, essentially. As for REST, we're a bit limited because yes, this will be a lot of work on backend and frontend side both to refactor them to what we wanted to see.
But we eventually, is it correct in assuming that we eventually want to see the Notes app consume GraphQL and not REST?
Well, from front-end side, I can say yes, please, but I would like to hear what backend thinks about this because it might be complicated.
Sorry, I'm raising my desk, so you might hear some noise. Yeah, I mean, in the sense that we want to move, as much functionality to GraphQL as possible, I would think the answer is yes there. Again, like I think it's a much more complicated change because it requires sort of the collaboration across stages. There's also like discussions in general is a major performance concern. Like not touching it as part of this is sort of disheartening, I guess, because like it's also an area where it's currently one of the main things that makes issues slow and painful, or lots of stuff slow and painful. So the opportunity to refactor it both to use GraphQL, potentially using GraphQL subscriptions, and then also to just improve the performance of it is appealing, and we need to get to that, but that feels like a very large scope in its own right. That might be separate from part of this, I guess.
I would say then, Gabe, for right now, keep it in scope. At least for like the next, we're basically exploring our ideas for the next 8 weeks to basically, I would hope we go through a series of diverge, converge experiments to figure out what the issue experience should be. at the end of this 8 weeks, at which point we can then break things down into buckets of work and tackle it. Because I do agree, like we have to, well, we don't have to, it is a huge opportunity to improve performance. It's also a huge opportunity to pay down technical debt, to basically standardize on using subscriptions and not the other real-time endpoint. And so I don't want to limit that, even if it is a big chunk of work. Like, let's just be honest about what it is and see if we can figure out how to sequence things in a way that makes sense. Because we could also, through this, discover that refactoring things to use subscriptions and going GraphQL first and doing some of the changes we want to do is also going to achieve our Q2 OKRs for the MR discussions performance improvement, right? We don't know right now. So
that segues into point number 2, Gabe. You said something that addressed point number 2 and I tried to capture it. Is that pretty accurate? Diverge, converge for the next 8 weeks on ways that we can address the top usability issues?
Yep.
Okay. What are some ideas for how we could do that?
I'm intentionally being quiet right now.
Which question were you referring to, Mike? I'm sorry, I was taking a note.
Point number 2, under questions. How do we want to self-organize to rapidly iterate and experiment on the new issue view?
I think I'm still a little bit fuzzy as to who all is going to be involved in this initially, but I mean, Alexis, feel free to jump in. I would say you and I probably would need to just start figuring out kind of what that plan needs to look like. I know we had talked about having 3 demos a week. So we can kind of figure out what that starting point needs to be and what we want to initially demo, and then can communicate that to the team. In the manage meeting earlier today, Pedro made a good point about new processes and documenting them. So I have created an issue, or I'm in the process of creating an issue. I've got the new issue view up, where we can kind of document this experience and how it goes in the event that this is something that other teams may want to try in the future and could benefit from. But I think just picking a place to start and starting is going to be the best place personally.
I will say, if it's helpful, there's sort of I can stop sharing my screen a second. There's kind of 2 big, I guess, blockers, and one is the UX system is what I'm calling it for the issue view or issuable view, which there's an issue for that. And then there's the other big thing to solve, because if we want to convert epics to a type of issue, it sort of is going to end up looking something similar to this, where you have this work item tree, right? And everything above, like a user story, for example, is technically an epic. And this is how our customers right now are using epics. Like, they will call it a capability and then an epic and then a feature. Then they'll break that down in individual issues that are user stories. At the same time, there's also like long-lived system designs, which are requirements that are going to have different levels of requirements management. And so this is where, like, getting issues, since requirements are now being converted to a type of issue, getting issues at the group level is part of a separate work stream, but will be important because it will sort of enable this kind of multi-level work breakdown across like your group subgroup hierarchy. But requirements have their own levels too. And then you also, when you look at quality management, you have like test sessions and then you have test cases. And these are based on issue types too. And so there's these different kind of trees of work items, and each serve sort of a different job to be done, but they're all related to, or ought to be related to, each other in one way or another. So that's where I see like the view itself, but then this like relationships experience of how you define a work item hierarchy, and then how you manage those relationships across to basically other levels or issue types or whatever in different work item hierarchies. So like those are 2 big buckets of things. I don't know how we want to tackle them, but I just thought I'd lay them out if that helps spur conversation.
I just read in there that something that might be helpful as we think about like how we organize this work is if we kind of think about the bucket of work that can be done essentially like around UX and the front end and stuff that we can do without drastically overhauling backend architecture or the way that models are structured and relate to each other, versus things that need, like for example, changing epic to a type of issue that's a holistic change that requires backend changes. Only because I only say that because we are seriously resource constrained on backend, and I'm practically being able to get much done on top of the performance and sort of like rapid action stuff we've been dealing with lately. Yeah, and Gabe, that sounds right. I just want to make sure that we kind of have that in mind so that we're not getting setting grand plans that then fall apart because we don't have the resources to complete them. And by resources, I mean people.
Yeah, I think we can break down the work this way once we land on what the ideal solution looks like. And then ideally, this is why I wanted to schedule out, start the back end or the major refactoring, the actual implementation of it, and two milestones away, so that we have time to plan, basically wrap up things that are already in flight, and make sure that we can assign resources or team members to this to work on the implementation. There will be things like outside of our control, like incidents and rapid action stuff, but High Network should be back by 14.1, hopefully, or 14.2 at the latest. We have, I don't know, 20 other engineers in plan that should be able to contribute to this as well. So I definitely think we want to like sequence stuff out so we aren't blocking each other, but we are going to have to make some backend changes. So, I mean, it's going to be what it's going to be.
Yeah, I'm wondering though, as we're going through the process, I think it'll be helpful to maybe not so much estimate it out and figure out what the level of effort is going to be on these things on the back end, but we do want to make sure that we're providing input on the feasibility technically of things. So if we go and design something that just it's impossible to implement on either the back end or the front end, that's something that we want to be informed of on the UX side as quickly as possible, so that we can change our approach. So I know Alexis, Holly, and Mike, you all are talking about half-hour, hour design reviews 3 times per week. Might be a bit much for, like, if we want everyone outside of designers to attend that and get provide input on feasibility. Could we do maybe like a weekly thing during, maybe plan weekly of presenting what you all have talked about during the week, and then we can provide the technical feasibility during those meetings? How's that sound?
I had a question about whether or not those need to be synchronous, or if those could be kind of a mix of sync and async, recorded, not recorded. My thought initially was that we could always do synchronous calls, maybe 1 synchronous per week, and then maybe 2 recorded, or just kind of tagging people in issues as well. But my thought is that it doesn't have to be one or the other.
The reason I picked 3 per week was, to be honest, it's out of a place of fear, so it's probably not really warranted. I'm worried that, or fearful that, if it's only once a week, we won't make as much progress in 8 weeks. That 8 weeks is going to go by really fast. I also think that starting out 3 times a week will help us get to a shared understanding faster. And yes, it would be synchronous. I think after a couple of weeks, we wouldn't have to be as audacious. We could potentially go to like once a week after doing that for 2 or 3 weeks. But maybe the risk there is that we don't get input from engineering often enough.
Well, I think there's, I agree with everything that's been said, and because we're at time right now and I want to be respectful of people's time, how do we break this up to continue async? All I was going to say, we could have one meeting basically where we do the plan weekly to get technical input from everyone on the team, but we can also have some async updates, also some updates with just maybe like interactions with product and design to kind of before we get to the technical piece. So we can kind of balance it out, but how do we want to split up right now moving forward, next steps? in terms of process? Do we need to have another sync meeting? What are y'all thinking?
I I created an issue. It needs to be updated and tweaked. Probably I'm just kind of dumping stuff in as we're talking, but we can always use that as kind of a continuation point if we need to. I put it in the agenda.
Which point? Okay, cool. Under 3.
Gabe,
Yeah, go for it, Alexis.
could you create like a issue just like from a product perspective around like objectives for, I guess, kind of like this agenda, but like a TLDR of it? What is the objectives of UX, of dev engineering, from a product perspective? Like, what are the timelines y'all are thinking of? And then we can maybe collaborate on that further as well.
Yeah, I will create that this afternoon. And then more or less, like if we make healthy progress async on that this week, then great. If not, I'll probably try to schedule another time for us to synchronously make a decision next Monday. So we'll take async and see if we can move things forward there. And if not, then we'll get back together synchronously. But I will create that issue in an hour or so.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Okay. Thanks for the time, everyone. I will upload this to YouTube, distribute, also attached to that issue, cross-link to Holly's issue that she created. If not, repurpose that issue or add to it if it has what we need on already.
Feel free to repurpose.
All right. Thanks for the time. And please, right now is open mind and ideas, so we don't need to limit ourselves too much. Let's get creative.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.